Good afternoon, Internet. My name is Mitek. I'm an unsuccessful middle-aged man, and this is my stream Dorkly Lit, where we used to play video games, but now we're reduced to reading Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide every now and then, and that's the entirety of our streams, basically. We occasionally read this, and only just yesterday we arrived at chapter 3, and this is probably the chapter that I'm most excited about, because one of the readers mentioned to me that this is the bit you want if you want to learn how to balance combat and make sure mechanically everything works out in your adventure, because that's the part that I'm worried the most about. I have different games in D&D and it went fine. I always had ideas for stories and I'm not really worried about the narrative and world part of it. I am worried about the rules and making it work. So without further ado, let's get to it. Chapter 3: Creating Adventures. Creating adventures is one of the greatest rewards of being a dungeon master. It's a way to express yourself, designing fantastic locations and encounters with monsters, traps, puzzles, and conflicts. When you design an adventure, you call the shots. You do things exactly the way you want to. Fundamentally, adventures are stories. An adventure shares many of the features of a novel, movie, an issue of a comic, or an episode of a TV show. Comic series and serialized TV dramas are particularly good comparisons because of the way individual adventures are limited in scope but blend together to create a larger narrative. If an adventure is a single issue or episode, the campaign is the series as a whole. When you're creating your own adventures or using published adventures, you'll find advice in this chapter to help you create a fun and memorable experience for your players. Creating an adventure involves blending scenes of exploration, social interaction, and combat into a unified whole that meets the needs of your players and your campaign. But it's more than that. The basic elements of good storytelling should guide you throughout this process, so your players experience the adventure as a story and not as disjointed series of encounters. Okay, so this might not be the chapter quite yet. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if we've been misled, if we misunderstood, or this is the chapter. Still, it's probably going to be more interesting than the past one, where they talked about mapping your world and that sort of thing. At least to me personally. I'm not really looking so much for world building tips or musings on genres of fantasy as something specifically about making it an adventure within Dungeons and Dragons. Because story is a story I can handle, and if it was a role-playing game that I'm familiar with, the rules already, I could probably, yeah, I'd handle that, but I just want to make a D&D adventure. It's not so much to ask. I want to know how. Elements of a great adventure. The best adventures have several things in common. A credible threat. An adventure needs a threat worthy of the hero's attention. The threat might be a single villain or monster, a villain with lackeys, an assortment of monsters, or an evil organization. Whatever their nature, the antagonist should have goals that the heroes can uncover and thwart. Okay, that's one way to look at it. I don't think you need a credible threat necessarily. Familiar tropes with clever twists. It might seem stereotypical to build an adventure around dragons, orcs, and insane wizards and towers, but these are the staples of fantasy storytelling. It might also seem trite to begin an adventure in a tavern, but that's an idea that remains true to D&D. Familiar story elements are fine as long as you and the players occasionally put a spin on them. For example, the mysterious figure who presents adventurers with a quest on behalf of the king might be the king in disguise. The crazy wizard in the tower might be a projected illusion created by a band of greedy gnome thieves to guard their loot. A clear focus on the present. An adventure is about the here and now. A little bit of history might be needed to set the story in motion, and adventurers might discover interesting lore of the past in the course of the adventure. In general, let the world's history be evident in the present situation instead of dealing with what happened in the past. An adventure should focus on describing the present situation, what the bad guys are up to, and how the adventurers become involved in the story. I 100% agree with this one. When storytelling, it's very easy to get caught in a trap where you have your story happen mostly in the past. Everything is a backstory, Everything is what already happened and it's the setup, and it shouldn't be like that. Like the backstory, you can have as much backstory as you want, but if your backstory is bigger than your actual story, then you're doing it wrong. Your story should be much bigger. The most important bits should happen in the story, not in the backstory, and they should happen to the players. It should not happen in the past of some NPC that we're uncovering the legacy of. That's like, you could do it, but why? It's less interesting, and I'm kind of guilty of it. I usually try to revise my stuff to make it so that if I can make something happen to the players in the now, I remake it so that it happens to the players in the now. And set up from the past, like prophecies, that sort of thing. Yeah, I use it too. I use it when it's necessary, when it's convenient, but you get the idea. Heroes who matter. An adventure should allow the adventurer's actions and decisions to matter. Though it might resemble a novel or a TV episode, an adventure needs to allow for more than one outcome. Otherwise, players can feel as if they've been railroaded, set on a course that has only one destination, no matter how hard they try to change it. For example, if a major villain shows up before the end of the adventure should allow for the possibility that the heroes might defeat the villain. I 100% agree on that. It's very easy to railroad your players, and it's not very easy to make an adventure that has a direction to it, that leads somewhere, and at the same time is open-ended, allows for the players to do whatever they want. Kind of challenging. Thank you for the follow. So, something for all player types. As outlined in the book's introduction, players come to the gaming table with different expectations, and adventure needs to account for the different players and characters in your group, drawing them into the story as effectively as possible. At the starting point, think about your adventure in terms of the three basic types of activity in the game: exploration, social interaction, and combat. If your adventure includes a balance of all three, it's likely to appeal to all types of players. An adventure you create for your home campaign doesn't have to appeal to every abstract player type, only to the players sitting down at your table. If you don't have any players who like fighting above all else, then don't feel you have to provide a maximum amount of combat to keep the adventure moving. That's pretty self-explanatory. I myself am not too much into combat, but since I started D&D, I'm increasingly more interested in that because it's a big part of the game, and it's a small part of the games that I played in the past. So. Surprises. Look for opportunities to surprise and delight your players. For example, the exploration of a ruined castle on a hill might lead to the discovery of a dragon's tomb hidden underneath. A trek through the wilderness might lead to the discovery of a tower that appears only on nights of the full moon. Players remember such locations. Too many surprises can be off-putting to players, but adding the occasional twist gets players to adjust their tactics and think creatively. For example, you could spruce up a goblin lair by including goblin sappers with kegs of oil strapped to their backs. An attack on a villain's estate might be complicated by the unexpected arrival of a special guest. When preparing for possible combat encounters, think about odd pairings of monsters, such as a hobgoblin warlord and his pet manticore, or will-o-wisps in league with a young black dragon. Have surprise reinforcements show up or give the monsters unusual tactics. Throw in the occasional red herring deception and plot twist to keep players on their toes, but try not to go overboard. Sometimes a simple straightforward encounter with an orc guard is just as fun for the players. When it comes to surprises in combat, I would only do what makes sense within the story. Even if you're more involved into the combat side of your game than I am, with mine, I think you shouldn't do things just to make a combat encounter more interesting the way video game combat encounters are designed to be interesting, where you have phases, you have stuff happening. It's not necessary. If it doesn't help the story, like, why bother? There's so many things you can do that fit within a story. For example, if you want to have a combat that isn't just about killing everything that moves, maybe you should start from the top, from the moment you design your whole story and make it about saving prisoners, right? And then when you get to combat, it makes sense that you have prisoners that need saving during this combat, and you need to actually protect them during the encounter itself. Actually, on the topic of that, and what if the players fail? If they don't account for the prisoners being there and they get them killed, that could be an interesting thing and a hook for what happens further in the story. Maybe they deal with guilt, maybe they deal with someone blaming them for what happened. Could be interesting. Okay, useful maps. A good adventure needs thoughtfully constructed maps. Wilderness areas sprinkled with interesting landmarks and other features are better than vast expanses of unchanging terrain. Dungeons that have branching corridors and similar decision points give players the opportunity to choose which direction their characters should go. Presenting the characters with options allows the players to make choices that keep the adventure unpredictable. If drawing maps isn't your strong suit, the internet is a great place to look for adventure maps that have been made freely available for use, as well as floor plans of real-world buildings and images that can inspire your map making. You can also use software to help you put maps together. For my first campaign, I'm probably going to have a hard time with it just because I have to do a desert. And what do you put in a desert? I'm going to need to come up with something more interesting than rocks for my maps. Maybe a giant skeleton, I don't know. Probably not. A giant dragon skeleton wouldn't exactly fit with the locale I have in mind, but we'll make it somehow. Okay, published adventures. Published adventures are available for purchase if you have neither the time nor the inclination to write an adventure of your own, or if you want a change of pace. A published adventure includes a pre-generated scenario with the maps, NPCs, monsters, and treasures you need to run it. An example of a published adventure appears in the D&D starter set. You can make adjustments to a published adventure so that it better suits your campaign and appeals to your players. For example, you can replace the villain of an adventure with one the players have already encountered in your campaign, or add something to the background of the adventure so that it involves players' characters in ways that the adventure's designer never could have imagined. A published adventure can't account for every action the characters might take. The nice thing about published adventures is that they allow you to focus your game preparation time on highlighting the plot developments in your campaign that the adventure can't address. Published adventures also provide inspiration. You might not use an adventure as written, but it might spur ideas, or you can pull out one part of it and repurpose that part for your needs. For example, you might use a map of temple, but repopulate it with monsters of your choice. Or you might use a chase sequence as a model for pursuit scene in your campaign. I'm actually curious about what published adventures look like. I wouldn't run one because I'm largely unimpressed with what I've seen of them, but I'd like to know how in-depth they go about what happens and what's detailed and what's not, because I want to write something that I'm gonna show to other people on the internet, not just for myself and my players. I want to write something that I'm gonna basically post probably on Reddit or somewhere better than Reddit. I don't know. I'd need to look into it. But if I end up writing it to completion, which I will, I hope I will, I'm 100% sure I want to share it and see if people like it or hate it. Adventure structure. Like every story, a typical adventure has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Beginning. An adventure starts with a hook to get the players interested. A good adventure hook piques the interest of players and provides a compelling reason for their characters to become involved in the adventure. Maybe the adventurers stumble onto something they are not meant to see. Monsters attack them on the road, an assassin makes an attempt on their lives, or a dragon shows up at the city gates. Adventure hooks such as these can instantly draw players into your story. I wish. From my experience as a DM, they can very often fail to draw the players into your adventure. You need to try really hard at times. Anyway, the beginning of a good adventure should be exciting and focused. You want the players to go home looking forward to the next session, so give them a clear sense of where the story is headed, as well as something to look forward to. Middle. The middle of an adventure is where the bulk of the story unfolds. With each new challenge, the adventurers make important choices that have a clear effect on the conclusion of the adventure. Over the course of the adventure, the characters might discover secrets that reveal new goals or change the original goal. Their understanding of what's going on around them might change. Maybe rumors of treasure were a trick to lure them into a death trap. Perhaps the so-called spy in the Queen's court is actually a scheme concocted by the monarch herself to seize even more power. At the same time, the adventurers are working to thwart their adversaries. These adversaries are trying to carry out their nefarious plans. Such enemies might also work to hide their deeds, mislead potential adversaries, or confront problems directly, perhaps by trying to kill the meddlers. Remember that the characters are the heroes of the story. Never let them become mere spectators, watching as events unfold around them that they can't influence. That's an important one. You can't put an event into your adventure that you're set in stone is going to happen no matter what they do, because it sort of feels unfair a lot of the time if you're the player. I mean, you can do it, some people do it, and you can do it if you want to, but you should really try not to. And I really try never to do this because it just feels unfair. I know it's hard to design the whole campaign in vacuum when you don't know if what you planned for your first game is even going to come to pass. That's why I don't like thinking too far ahead with these things, I suppose. Ending. The ending encompasses the climax, the scene or encounter in which the tension building throughout the adventure reaches its peak. A strong climax should have the players on edge, with the fate of the characters and much more hanging in the balance. The outcome, which changes in the characters' actions and decisions, should never be a foregone conclusion. An ending needn't tie everything up in a neat bow. Story threads can be left hanging, waiting to be resolved in a later adventure. A little bit of unfinished business is an easy way to transition from one adventure to the next. Adventure types. An adventure can be location-based or event-based, as discussed in the sections that follow. Location-based adventures. Adventures set in crumbling dungeons and remote wilderness locations are the cornerstone of countless campaigns. Many of the greatest D&D adventures of all time are location-based. Creating a location-based adventure can be broken down into a number of steps. Each step provides tables from which you can select the basic elements of your adventure. Alternatively, roll on the tables and see how the random results inspire you. You can mix up the order of the steps. Identify the party's goals. The Dungeon Goals table provides common goals that drive or lure adventurers into dungeons. The Wilderness Goals table provides similar inspiration for an adventure focused on outdoor exploration. The other goals table suggests location-based adventures that don't fit neatly into the first two categories. Dungeon Goals. D20. 1. Stop the dungeon's monstrous inhabitants from raiding the surface world. 2. Foil a villain's evil scheme. 3. Destroy a magical threat inside the dungeon. 4. Acquire treasure. 5. Find a particular item for a specific purpose. 6. Retrieve a stolen item hidden in the dungeon. 7. Find information needed for a special purpose. 8. Rescue a captive. 9. Discover the fate of a previous adventuring party. 10. Find an NPC who disappeared in the area. 11. Slay a dragon or some other challenging monster. 12. Discover the nature and origin of a strange location or phenomenon. 13. Pursue fleeing foes, taking refuge in the dungeon. 14. Escape from captivity in the dungeon. 15. Clear a ruin so it can be rebuilt and reoccupied. 16. Discover why a villain is interested in the dungeon. 17. Win a bet or complete a rite of passage by surviving in the dungeon for a certain amount of time. 18. Parley with a villain in the dungeon. 19. Hide from a threat outside the dungeon. 20. Roll twice, ignoring results of 20. I don't think it's very inspiring, these options, and players might not be that interested. For example, somebody tells them they have to discover the fate of a previous adventuring party and they're not so keen on it. Like they might not be, depending on who the player characters are as people. Or maybe parley with a villain in the dungeon. They might not want to do that at all if they're very lawful. I mean, you shouldn't do dungeon goals at random unless you want to do it for a challenge or try to inspire yourself. You should just, before you start the adventure, ask your players to make a character that has some business there. For example, if it's your first adventure with a given player and they're making a new character, that's the ideal thing. And then you can actually design bits of the dungeon with the character's backstory in mind. Wilderness Goals. D20. 1. Locate a dungeon or other site of interest. Roll on the Dungeon Goals table to find out why. 2. Assess the scope of a natural or unnatural disaster. 3. Escort an NPC to a destination. 4. Arrive at a destination without being seen by the villain's forces. 5. Stop monsters from raiding caravans and farms. Like, that one is so stock it hurts. 6. Establish trade with a distant town. 7. Protect a caravan traveling to a distant town. 8. Map a new land. 9. Find a place to establish a colony. 10. Find a natural resource. 11. Hunt a specific monster. 12. Return home from a distant place. 13. Obtain information from a reclusive hermit. 14. Find an object that was lost in the wild. 15. Discover the fate of a missing group of explorers. 16. Pursue fleeing foes. 17. Assess the size of an approaching army. 18. Escape the reign of a tyrant. 19. Protect a wilderness site from attackers. 20. Roll twice, ignoring results of 20. Other goals. D12. 1. Seize control of a fortified location, such as a fortress, town, or ship. 2. Defend the location from attackers. 3. Retrieve an object from inside a secure location in a settlement. 4. Retrieve an object from a caravan. 5. Salvage an object or goods from a lost vessel or caravan. 6. Break a prisoner out of jail or prison camp. 7. Escape from a jail or prison camp. 8. Successfully travel through an obstacle course to gain recognition or reward. 9. Infiltrate a fortified location. 10. Find the source of strange occurrences in a haunted house or other location. 11. Interfere with the operation of a business. 12. Rescue a character, monster, or object from a natural or unnatural disaster. Okay, so 2. Identify important NPCs. Use the adventure villains, adventure allies, and adventure patrons tables to help you identify these NPCs. Chapter 4 can help you bring these NPCs to life. Oh my god, it's all tables. Why would anyone do that? But we have it here, so let's read it. Let's see what they have for the people who enjoy the random. D20 villain. 1. Beast or monstrosity with no particular agenda. 2. Aberration bent on corruption or domination. 3. Fiend bent on corruption or destruction. 4. Dragon bent on domination and plunder. 5. Giant bent on plunder. 6 to 7. Undead with any agenda. 8. Fae with a mysterious goal. 9 to 10. Humanoid cultist. 11 to 12. Humanoid conqueror. 13. Humanoid seeking revenge. 14 to 15. Humanoid schemer seeking to rule. 16. Humanoid criminal mastermind. 17 to 18. Humanoid raider or ravager. 19. Humanoid under a curse. 20. Misguided humanoid zealot. Misguided. That's so nice. He's not evil, just has it all wrong. It's already a trope probably by now, but it's far more interesting than most of the ones on this list. Humanoid under a curse is also quite interesting. I like villains that have good reasons. I like villains that aren't evil at all if possible. That's like the ideal thing. Someone is cast into the role of a villain because they have to do something. Maybe they're the hero of absolute sacrifice, and they have to do something that's firmly against their morals, but they're choosing the lesser evil, and they have to do it for the sake of their people, for example. For a past project, I read a story like that where the main character that we're eventually confronted with is not evil at all. She just has to choose the well-being of her people over the well-being of the people of the main character, and that's how it has to go. She's probably even more morally upright than the main character was in that story project. It was kind of cool, and we even had a much more villainous character there that was kind of easy to dislike, but didn't end up being the one the main character has to confront and ultimately kill. Anyway. Adventure allies. D12. 1. Skilled adventurer. 2. Inexperienced adventurer. 3. Enthusiastic commoner. 4. Soldier. 5. Priest. 6. Sage. 7. Revenge seeker. 8. Raving lunatic. 9. Celestial ally. 10. Fey ally. 11. Disguised monster. 12. Villain posing as an ally. That's such a trope. Well, will we flesh out the location details? Yeah. Flesh out the location details. Chapter 5 offers suggestions for creating and fleshing out an adventure location, including tables that can help you establish the important elements of a dungeon. Wilderness area or urban setting. Find the ideal introduction. An adventure can begin with a social interaction encounter in which the adventurers find out what they must do and why. So the classic, you can see a stranger in a black hood in the corner of a tavern, and in the shadows, he could be even smoking a pipe, I don't know. But that's you get that stuff a lot. So that sort of thing. It can start with a surprise attack or with the adventurers coming across information by accident. The best introductions arise naturally from goals and settings of the adventure. Let the entries in the adventure introduction table inspire you. Oh, I already have an introduction in mind, but let's read those. D12. While traveling in the wilderness, the characters fall into a sinkhole that opens beneath their feet, dropping them into the adventure location. 2. While traveling in the wilderness, the characters notice the entrance to the adventure location. that one is horrible. 3. While traveling on the road, the characters are attacked by monsters that flee into the nearby adventure location. That one is equally horrible. 4. The adventurers find a map on a dead body. In addition to the map setting up the adventurer's villain wants the map. 5. A mysterious magic item or a cruel villain teleports the characters to the adventure location. 6. A stranger approaches the characters in a tavern and urges them towards the adventure location. So that's the classic I mentioned. 7. A town or village needs volunteers to go to the adventure location. 8. An NPC the characters care about needs them to go on the adventure location. 9. An NPC the characters must obey orders them to go to the adventure location. 10. An NPC the characters respect asks them to go to the adventure location. 11. One night the characters all dream about entering the adventure location. That one is awful. Why would they dream about it? Unless you have a great idea why that makes sense, and a big revelation at the end that would make players go, whoa! Mind blown. I wouldn't do that one. That one sounds not, like, really not very good. 12. A ghost appears and terrorizes a village. Research reveals that it can be put to rest only by entering the adventure location. I think the chief bad thing about these 12 things that I don't like is that it treats the quote-unquote adventure location as an obstacle course, and the adventure is going through it. And that's not really what my ideal adventure is. My ideal adventure is much more like a movie. And the movie doesn't have to happen in a single location. It could take the characters wherever they need to be, or it could happen over the course of a single conversation. Doesn't matter, so long as the story is interesting, of course. 5. Consider the ideal climax. The climactic ending of an adventure fulfills the promise of all that came before. Although the climax must hinge on the successes and failures of the characters up to that moment, the adventure climax table can provide suggestions to help you shape the end of your adventure. Adventure climax, D12, climax. 1. The adventurers confront the main villain and a group of minions in a bloody battle to the finish. 2. The adventurers chase the villain while dodging obstacles designed to thwart them, leading to a final confrontation in or outside the villain's refuge. 3. The actions of the adventurers or the villain result in a cataclysmic event that the adventurers must escape. 4. The adventurers race to the site where the villain is, bringing a master plan to its conclusion, arriving just as that plan is about to be completed. That's such a trope. 5. The villain and 2 or 3 lieutenants perform separate rites in a large room. The adventurers must disrupt all 3 rites at the same time. 6. An ally betrays the adventurers as they are about to achieve their goal. Use this climax carefully and don't overuse it. 7. A portal opens to another plane of existence. Creatures on the other side spill out, forcing the adventurers to close the portal and deal with the villain at the same time. 8. Traps, hazards, or animated objects turn against the adventurers while the main villain attacks. 9. The dungeon begins to collapse while the adventurers face the main villain, who attempts to escape the chaos. 10. A threat more powerful than the adventurers appears, destroys the main villain, and then turns its attention to the characters. 11. The adventurers must choose whether to pursue the fleeing main villain, or save an NPC they care about or a group of innocents. 12. The adventurers must discover the main villain's secret weakness before they can hope to defeat that villain. And a bunch of these have the problem of being very video game-like, which I don't approve of. But at the same time, I understand the writers of this book, because you really want tropes when you're designing a table to roll on, right? It's a table to roll on, and if it was full of very quirky, offbeat things, it would always suggest a quirky, offbeat thing and be weird. But me, in stories, I'm against tropes. I hate tropes, really. Storytelling, well, these sort of tropes. I don't mind visual tropes. Visual tropes kinda work for me. I don't mind those. But storytelling tropes, if I've seen it like a billion times, like on the billionth time, it's no matter how good it was the first time around, it's gonna be boring because you expect it. What I like inverted tropes, where the story sets you up to think in a certain way. Expect a trope, and what you get is the very opposite of a trope. That sort of thing I like, especially if it gets me. If I was like, oh, and now it's what's gonna happen is this, that, and this, and then I am proven wrong because the exact opposite happens, or something completely unexpected interrupts the flow of the story before it comes to that. I love that sort of thing, but it's very rare in fiction. 6. Plan encounters. After you've created the location and the overall story of the adventure, it's time to plan out the encounters that make up that adventure. In a location-based adventure, most encounters are key to a specific location on the map. For each room or wilderness area on the adventure map, your key describes what's in that area. its physical features as well as any encounter that plays out there. The adventure key turns a simple sketch of numbered areas on graph paper into encounters designed to entertain and intrigue your players. I wouldn't think about my adventure as encounters. I would never, but that's very D&D-like, I feel like. So see creating encounters later in this chapter for guidance on crafting individual encounters. Event-based adventures. In an event-based adventure, the focus is on what the characters and villains do, and what happens as a result. The question of where these things happen is of secondary importance. That's my kind of thinking. Event-based adventure, huh? So I like event-based adventures. Building an event-based adventure is more work than building a location-based one, but the process can be simplified by following a number of straightforward steps. Several steps include tables from which you can choose adventure elements or roll randomly for inspiration. As with location-based adventures, you don't necessarily have to follow these steps in order. A memory, like a distant memory, came back to me just now when I was reading it. When I was a new DM, coming up with any sort of story, any story at all, anything to put into my game was grueling. I had such a hard time with coming up with anything at all. And now that I think about it, if I read that when I was much younger and much more inexperienced with stories in general, but also with RPG, that would have been of much help. That would have probably resonated with me, say, 15 years ago or 16 years ago if I read it then. Even these tables, even that would have inspired me. So I guess it's not that bad. It's probably more geared towards people who are making their first adventure, not grizzled old men who just want to switch RPG systems. 1. Start with the villain. Putting care into creating your villain will pay off later, since the villain plays such a pivotal role in advancing the story. We use the adventure villains table in the previous sections to get started, and use that information in chapter 4 to help flesh out the villain. For example, your villain might be an undead creature seeking to avenge a past imprisonment or injury. An interesting aspect of an undead villain is that this past injury might have occurred centuries ago, inspiring revenge against the descendants of those that harmed it. Imagine a vampire imprisoned by the members of a religious order of knights, who now seeks revenge against the current members of that order. And on the topic of my past DMing when I was a fresh new DM, coming up with even mediocre ideas was so hard. I find it really hard to believe that I was such a bad DM now that I recall it. It got better eventually, and I'd like to think that my next adventure is going to be the best thing I've ever done, or at the very least the best within the confines of D&D that I can do, because it's going to be the bee's knees. It's going to be great, and no matter what players get, it's going to be all roses and rainbows. That's what I'd like to think. It's probably not going to be that, but 2. Determine the villain's actions. Once you have a villain, it's time to determine what steps the villain takes to achieve its goals. Create a timeline showing what the villain does and when, assuming no interference from the adventurers. Building on the previous example, you might decide that your vampire villain murders several knights by slipping past locked doors in gaseous form. The vampire is able to make the deaths appear natural at first, but it soon becomes clear that the depraved killer is behind the murders. If you need additional inspiration, consider a few different options while the villain's actions unfold over the course of the adventure. Actually, coming up with a timetable is very smart, because if you don't come up with this ahead of time, you might feel like, players tarry, they take too long, they do nothing, right? You might feel like coming up with, on the spot with ideas, okay, so I'll have the villain kill XYZ, right? It might feel unfair, it might feel arbitrary, but if you had the timetable ahead of schedule, maybe they don't have to kill anyone, they could do something that the players do not expect, and it will feel very, very horrible to them personally. Maybe they're going to outwit them and take something from them, or destroy something dear to them, whatever, right? If you had a timetable ahead of time, and they're gonna do it unless players do something before that to prevent this, it no longer feels unfair. They had it coming. Yeah, that's a good idea, and it's something I've never done before. And now I might. Okay, event-based villain actions. Okay, D6 type of actions. 1 big event, 2 crime spree, 3 growing corruption, 4 1 and done, 5 serial crimes, 6 step by step. Okay, so now let's see what they each mean. Big event. The villain's plans come to fruition during a festival, an astrological event, a holy or unholy rite, a royal wedding, the birth of a child, or some similar fixed time. The villain's activities up to that point are geared toward preparation for this event. Oh yeah, The Birth of a Child, that's a classic. Evil fairy appears and says something like, you did not invite me to this, like all the good fairies, so I'm gonna curse the princess so that when she pricks her finger on her 18th birthday, she's gonna die, right? Or fall into a sleep. That sort of thing. That's a classic. And also, on the topic of that sort of thing, you get the idea when a supernatural entity or a witcher asks for the thing that you already own but don't yet know you own it, or the first thing that comes to greet you when you come back to your home, that sort of thing. And the guy who owes a due comes back and he finds out that his wife is pregnant, for example, and he has to give away the child at birth, and this grim collector appears, like in the Witcher series, Witcher stories, like not the saga, this sort of thing. Well, that's a bit of a spoiler, but this sort of thing happens to Geralt. In the past, the witchers used to do it. It was sort of a tradition that witchers would get children to be new witchers in that way. It really happened and it was present in stories, but it was kind of very old school. The modern day witchers, they didn't believe in that sort of crap, and they didn't really believe that there needs to be a new generation of witchers in Geralt's time. But one of these days, Geralt saves a guy on a bridge, on a stone bridge. He saves a guy and his cargo on a cart, right? And he's slashed very badly, and the guy tells him that he's gonna give him anything. He basically insists that Geralt asks for a reward, and I think at this point Geralt's already very wounded, and he says the line, "Give me that which you already have but do not know," something along these lines. I'm not sure, I'd have to reread it because it was quite some time ago when I last read it, and lo and behold, what happens when they get back to the guy's house? I'm not gonna tell you. Like, I'm not gonna tell you, you're gonna have to read the book. Okay. That was a completely unnecessary tangent and a spoiler. If I could, I'd take that back, but let's get back to reading. Growing corruption. As time passes, the villain's power and influence grow, affecting more victims across a larger area. This might take the form of armies conquering new territory, an evil cult recruiting new members, or a spreading plague. A pretender to the throne might attempt to secure the support of the kingdom's nobility in the days or weeks leading up to a coup, or a guild leader could corrupt the members of the town council or bribe officers of the watch. By the way, the bit from The Witcher that I just recounted, that's my favorite short story about The Witcher, my absolute favorite one, from my absolute favorite Witcher book. And that's very close to my absolute favorite moment in that book. It's very strong. I like it. It's very iconic. It's a bit of a trope, but at the same time the setup is so nice, and literally it's crafted in a nice way. So yeah, I appreciate that sort of thing. And it's not such an opaque trope, because what happens is like the guy's wife isn't pregnant. That's not what happens when they get back to his hut. I strongly recommend that you read Witcher books if you can get a translation in your language of choice. Okay, one and done. The villain commits a single crime and then tries to avoid the consequences. Instead of an ongoing plan to commit more crimes, the villain's goal is to lie low or flee the scene. 0 crimes. The villain commits crimes one after the other, but these acts are repetitive in nature rather than escalating to greater heights of depravity. The trick to catching such villain lies in determining the pattern underlying the crimes. Though serial killers are a common example of this type of villain, your villain could be a serial arsonist favoring a certain type of building, a magical sickness that affects spellcasters who cast a specific spell, a thief that targets a certain kind of merchant, or a doppelganger kidnapping and impersonating one noble after another. Step by step, in pursuit of its goal, the villain carries out a specific set of actions in a particular sequence. A wizard might steal the items needed to create a phylactery and become a lich, or a cultist might kidnap the priest of 7 good aligned gods as a sacrifice. Alternatively, the villain could be following a trail to find the object of his revenge, killing one victim after another while moving ever closer to the real target. 3. Determine the party's goals. You can use the event-based goals table to set the party's goal. A goal can also suggest ways in which the adventurers become caught up in the villain's plans, and what exactly they must do to foil these plans. Event-based goals. D20. 1. Bring the villain to justice. 2. Clear the name of an innocent NPC. 3. Protect or hide an NPC. 4. Protect an object. 5. Discover the nature and origin of a strange phenomenon that might be the villain's doing. 6. Find a wanted fugitive. 7. Overthrow a tyrant. 8. Uncover a conspiracy to overthrow a ruler. 9. Negotiate peace between enemy nations or feuding families. 10. Secure aid from a ruler or council. 11. Help a villain find redemption. 12. Parley with a villain. 13. Smuggle weapons to rebel forces. 14. Stop a band of smugglers. 15. Gather intelligence on an enemy force. 16. Win a tournament. 17. Determine the villain's identity. 18. Locate the stolen item. 19. Make sure a wedding goes off without a hitch. 20. Roll twice, ignoring results of 20. For example, you roll a 10 on the table, indicating that the party's goal is to secure aid from a ruler or council. You decide to connect that to the leadership of the order targeted by your vampire villain. Maybe the order's leaders have a chest of jewels stolen from that vampire centuries ago, and the characters can use the chest as bait to trap the villain. 4. Identify important NPCs. Many event-based adventures require a well-detailed cast of NPCs. Some of these NPCs fall neatly into the categories of allies and patrons, but most are likely to be characters or creatures whose attitudes towards the adventurers remain undecided until the adventurers interact with them. See Chapter 4 for more information on creating NPCs. From my experience as a DM, the players have a unique gift for antagonizing NPCs. You could come up with the most mellow, nice, easygoing NPC, and one of these days the players are gonna come up with a way to annoy them to death just cause. If they don't like him. It's always a hit or miss. I never know which NPCs my players are gonna hit it off with and be friends with, and which they'll see as, ugh, I hate that guy. I feel like they roll on a random table, honestly. I haven't played a game in such a long time. Maybe it would be different nowadays. I don't know. I'm very curious how different my game as a DM is going to be from my games as a DM when I was young. The elements of the adventure you've determined so far could provide a clear idea of what supporting characters you need to create, as well as how much detail you need to generate for each one. NPCs unlikely to become involved in combat don't need full combat statistics, for example, just as characters heavily involved in negotiation could have ideals, bonds, and flaws. If it's helpful, roll on the Adventure Allies or Adventure Patrons table in the Location-Based Adventures section earlier in this chapter. 5. Anticipate the villain's reactions. If the adventurers pursue their goals and foil the villain's plans, how does the villain respond? Does it lash out in violence or send dire warnings? Does it look for simple solutions to its problems or create more complicated schemes to route around interference? Look over the villain's actions that you outlined in Step 2. For each event arising from these actions, think about how the adventurers are likely to react. If they can prevent an action or hamper its success, what effect does that have on the villain's overall plan? What can the villain do to compensate? One way to track a villain's reactions is by using a flowchart. This might grow out of the timeline that describes the villain's plans, outlining how the villain gets back on track after the adventurers thwart its plans. Or the flowchart could be separate from the timeline, showing the various actions the adventurers might take and the villain's response to these actions. I think that's too complicated. The way the players roleplay their characters and just try to be them, you can do the same for your villain. Just roleplay him and be him and decide as him. Right? I think this is going too far. It's gonna eat into your time very significantly, and it's gonna make you more reluctant to depart from your plan when players do something unexpected, and you should be ready to depart from your plan when players do something unexpected. Okay, number 6. Detail key locations. Since locations aren't the focus of the adventure, they can be simpler and smaller than a dungeon complex or an expanse of wilderness. They might be specific locations in a city, or even individual rooms in locations where combat is likely to break out, or significant exploration is needed, such as a throne room, a guild headquarters, a vampire's crumbling manor, or a knight's chapter house. 7. Choose an introduction and a climax. The adventure introduction table in the location-based adventures offers fun possibilities for hooking the characters and events of your adventure, including dreams, hauntings, and simple plea for help. The adventure climax table in that same section includes adventure endings that work just as well for event-based adventures. For example, the adventure introduction table helps you decide what ally the adventurer care about needs their help. Perhaps the NPC is a knight who believes that a vampire is trying to kill him, or a friend or relative hoping to find the knight's murderer. This NPC brings the vampire's crime to the character's attention. Looking over the adventure climax table, you might decide to have the adventurers beat the vampire with a chest of jewels stolen from his lair. As an added twist, you decide that the vampire's true goal is to retrieve a necklace among the jewels. The necklace is set with 9 gems, and with these gems the vampire can open a gate to 9 hells. Should the vampire succeed, the adventurers will have a more pressing threat to deal with, as a powerful devil steps through the gate and honors some ancient pact it made with the vampire. 8. Plan encounters. After you've created the overall story of the adventure, it's time to plan out the encounters on which the events of that adventure will hang. In an event-based adventure, encounters occur when the villain's agenda intersects the path of the characters. You can't always anticipate exactly when or where that will happen, but you can create a list of possible encounters that the adventurers might experience. This can take the form of general descriptions of the villain's forces, details of his lieutenants and minions, as well as encounters tied to the key locations of the adventure. See Creating Encounters later in this chapter for guidance on crafting individual encounters. Mysteries. A mystery is a form of event-based adventure that usually focuses on the adventurer's efforts to solve a crime, usually a robbery or murder. Unlike the writer of a mystery novel, Dungeon Master can't always predict what the characters will do in a mystery adventure. A villain whose actions are crime spree, one and done, or serial crimes might inspire you to craft a mystery adventure around the villain's crimes. Similarly, if the adventurer's goals include determining the villain's identity, that might be a part of a mystery. To build a mystery adventure, follow the steps for creating any event-based adventure. Then, consider 3 additional elements for the adventure: the victim, the suspects, and the clues. Victim. Think about the victim's relationship to the villain. Though you can create a strong scenario with no such relationship, part of what makes a mystery exciting is the discovery of the twisted connections between NPCs and how these connections led to the crime. A random killing might be just as mysterious, but it lacks that emotional connections. Also look for a connection between the victim and one or more adventurers. One surefire way to draw adventurers into a mystery, including making them a suspect, is to make the victim someone with whom the characters are acquainted. Suspect. Your cast of characters should include an assortment of other NPCs who didn't commit the crime, but who had the motive, the means, or the opportunity to do so. Suspects might be obvious or could come to light during the investigation. One technique used in detective fiction is to create a closed circle of suspects, a finite number of individuals whose circumstances make them the only possible suspects. One tip for keeping the players and the adventurers guessing as to the identity of the villain is to ensure that more than one suspect has a secret. When questioned by the adventurers, a suspect might appear nervous or attempt to lie, despite being innocent of the crime. A secret business deal, an illicit affair, a dark past, or an uncontrolled vice are flaws that make suspects more interesting than NPCs with nothing to hide. I don't much like a murder mystery, especially for fantasy, it doesn't fit, but the idea of a mystery, of the structure of a mystery to your adventure, it's very appealing for me. I mentioned in one of the earlier streams that I like the Harry Potter books, and I think that these are a great example of a mystery story that isn't a murder mystery. It's not even a crime mystery, almost ever, but it's structured in the same way. The books are structured in the same way. You have secret hints to also add to the books when you want to revisit them, when you want to read them again. You can see these hints of what's to come that you made nothing of when you first read the book, and they have the similar revelation at the ending as the POW. Actually, professors, that would be another spoiler. I'm not gonna spoil 2 books in one stream. Clues. Clues point to the identity of the villain. Some clues are verbal, including the statements of the suspects and witnesses that help the adventurers develop a picture of what happened. Other clues are physical, such as an unfinished message written in the victim's blood, a piece of jewelry left behind the villain, or a weapon found hidden in a suspect's room. A clue should connect a suspect to the crime, typically by shedding light on the suspect's motive, means, or opportunity. Some clues connect the wrong suspect to the crime, leading the adventurers in the wrong direction. Eventually, they must find other clues pointing in a different direction or come across evidence that absolves the suspect. It's better to populate your adventure with too many clues than too few. If the adventurers solve the mystery too quickly, you might feel some disappointment, but the players will feel a sense of accomplishment. If the mystery is too hard, though, the players will become frustrated, since you have to account for the possibility that the adventurers will overlook some clues. Use redundant clues to ensure that the players have the knowledge they need to catch the villain. Intrigue. Intrigue adventures are event-based adventures that revolve around power struggles. Intrigues are common in the courts of the nobility, but power struggles can play out just as easily in merchants' guilds, crime syndicates, and temple hierarchies. Rather than dark events and villainous plots, intrigue adventure typically revolves around exchange of favors, the rise and fall of individuals in power and influence, and the honeyed words of diplomacy. A prince's efforts to be named heir to the throne, a courtier's ambition to sit at the queen's right hand, and a merchant's desire to open a trade route through enemy lands are the stuff of intrigue. Like all adventures, an intrigue adventure works only if the players and their characters are invested in the outcome. If no one cares who the King's Chamberlain is or who has logging rights in the Elven Woods, throwing the characters into an adventure centered on these issues will fall flat. However, if the ear of the King's Chamberlain means the characters can use royal soldiers to help them defend their own stronghold on the borderlands, players will be invested in the scenario. Adventurers usually become embroiled in intrigue when they need a favor from a powerful creature and have to perform a favor in exchange, or when the plots of powerful NPCs get in the way of the characters achieving their goals. Some of the event-based goals discussed earlier in this section lend themselves to intrigue adventures. For example, if the adventurers must uncover a conspiracy, negotiate a peace treaty, or secure aid from a ruler or council, you might be looking at an intrigue adventure. The process of creating an intrigue adventure is similar to creating any other event-based adventure, with two main differences: how villains are handled and how the characters can gain influence. Villains. Some intrigue adventures are driven by the actions of a single villain, such as a noble plotting the assassination of a monarch. However, an intrigue adventure can have multiple villains, or no villain at all. No villain. Some intrigue adventures revolve around the exchange of favors in the absence of a villain. For this type of adventure, skip steps 1 and 2 of the event-based adventure creation process, the villain and the villain's actions, and move straight to the adventurer's goals in step 3. Figure out why the adventurers become involved in the intrigue, and spend the bulk of your time creating the NPCs they interact with. Many villains. Some intrigue adventures feature a whole cast of villains, each with its own goals, motivations, methods. The adventurers might be drawn into a struggle of a court full of nobles vying for the throne in the wake of the kingdom's sudden death, or could find themselves negotiating the end to a deadly turf war among Thieves' Guild. In this scenario, you'll spend a lot of time on steps 1 and 2 developing each of the major NPCs as a distinct villain with an agenda. In step 5, you'll need to develop each villain's reactions to the potential setbacks they face during the adventure. However, you don't need to put equal effort in detailing the reactions of every villain, since many will likely echo each other or cancel each other out. Whenever the adventurers foil one villain's plans, it might let another villain's schemes move forward, advancing the adventure whether the foiled villain reacts or not. I'm actually into other types of adventures without a villain. You don't need a villain specifically. Many villains is also good, actually. A conflict between evil and evil is probably more compelling than a conflict between good and evil a lot of the times. For example, in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the backstory of Spike and Angel when they were both evil and they hated each other's guts despite being both evil. It's interesting when a villain wants to kill another villain. Or the Blood War. The Blood War in Forgotten Realms, it's not strictly in Forgotten Realms. In the multiverse, right, in the lower planes of D&D, the Blood War, that's a great example of a conflict where we have both sides that are evil and they hate each other's guts and they're out to get each other. Blood War is an idea for a campaign. That could be interesting. I have many ideas, and I'm pretty much set what I want to do for my first campaign, and I'm pretty much set for what I want to do for my second one. Or rather, my first game, and then the second one is probably going to be a real campaign. And for that, I also kind of have an idea what I'd like. Blood War probably doesn't fit anywhere into this, but who knows? Maybe I'll change my mind. Influence. Depending on the scenario, you might want to track the party's influence with different NPCs or factions, or even track influence separately for each character. Don't do it. Like, come on, you can remember what the character thinks of them, and you don't need to put a number to it. Please don't. One way to handle influence is to treat it like inspiration. A character gains influence in a certain situation only if you grant it, and bringing influence into play requires spending it. Characters can gain influence by doing favors for NPCs. advancing the cause of an organization, or demonstrating their power and heroism at your discretion. As with inspiration, a character can choose to spend influence to gain advantage on a rule relevant to that influence. Another way to handle influence is to treat it like renown, see chapter 1, allowing characters to gain renown at a court and within various key factions. Framing events. You can base an entire adventure on a framing event or use such an event to grab the player's interest. The framing events table presents several ideas you can use to inspire your own framing event. D100 1 to 2 Anniversary of a monarch's reign. 3 to 4 Anniversary of an important event. 5 to 6 Arena event. 7 to 8 Arrival of a caravan or ship. 9 to 10 Arrival of a circus. 11 to 12 Arrival of an important NPC. So does it mean that when Matt Mercer made the second campaign for Critical Role, he rolled on this table and rolled a 9 or a 10 and it started the arrival of a circus? No way. But it could be true. He might have. Anyway, where were we? 11 to 12 Arrival of an important NPC. 13 to 14 Arrival of marching moderns. That's hard to put into your campaign in a way where it doesn't look jarring and weird. 15 to 16 Artistic performance. 17 to 18 Athletic event. 19 to 20 Birth of a child. 21 to 22 Birthday of an important NPC. 23 to 24 Civic festival. 25 to 26 Comet appearance. 27 to 28 Commemoration of a past tragedy. 29 to 30 Consecration of a new temple. 31 to 32 Coronation. 33 to 34 Council meeting. 35 to 36 Equinox or solstice. 37 to 38 Execution. 39 to 40 Fertility festival. 41 to 42 Full moon. 43 to 44 Funeral. 45 to 46 Graduation of cadets or wizards. 47 to 48 Harvest festival. 49 to 50 Holy day. 51 to 52 Investiture of a knight or other noble. 53 to 54 Lunar eclipse. 55 to 58 Midsummer festival. 59 to 60 Midwinter festival. 61 to 62 Migration of monsters. 63 to 64 Monarch's ball. 65 to 66 New moon. 67 to 68 New year. 69 to 70 Pardoning of a prisoner. 71 to 72 Planar conjunction. 73 to 74 Planetary alignment. 75 to 76 Priestly investiture. 77 to 78 Procession of ghosts. 79 to 80 Remembrance of soldiers lost in war. 81 to 82 Royal address or proclamation. 83 to 84 Royal audience day. 85 to 86 Signing a treaty. 87 to 88 Solar eclipse. 89 to 91 Tournament. 92 to 94 Trial. 95 to 96 Violent uprising. 97 to 98 Wedding or wedding anniversary. 99 to 100 Concurrence of two events. Roll twice, ignoring results of 99 or 100. That's it. Well, what are the two most ridiculous concurring events that you could get? Okay, I already know probably. Let me just take a look. Midwinter festival and Midsummer festival. Those two, if you rolled that. Yeah. Anyway, complications. Sometimes an adventure isn't as straightforward as it might seem. If you want to give the characters a crisis that no amount of spellcasting or swordplay can resolve, add a moral quandary to the adventure. A moral quandary is a problem of conscience for which the adventurers must make a single choice, but never a simple one. We can, I guess, decide on a moral quandary by rolling a d20. That's not how I would do it, but d20 an ally quandary, whatever they mean by it. 4 to 6 friend quandary. 7 to 12 honor quandary. 13 to 16 rescue quandary. 17 to 20 respect quandary. And an ally quandary apparently is when the adventurers have a better chance of achieving their goal with the help of two individuals whose expertise is all but essential. However, these two NPCs hate each other and refuse to work together, even if the fate of the world hangs in the balance. The adventurers must choose the NPC that is most likely to help them accomplish their goal. Friend quandary. An NPC that one or more of the characters cares about makes an impossible demand on the characters. A love interest might demand that the character turn away from a dangerous quest. A dear friend might plead with the characters to spare the villain's life to prove that they are better than the villain. A weak NPC might beg for a chance to win favor from the characters by undertaking a dangerous but essential mission. All of these seem pretty nice, seem pretty cool. A bit stock, but they're actually good plot points. I like making my players discuss or ponder something. That's always more interesting than just hack and slash and that sort of thing. Honor quandary. A character is forced to choose between victory and a personal oath or code of honor. A paladin who has sworn the oath of virtue might realize that the clearest path to success lies in deceit and subterfuge. A loyal cleric might be tempted to disobey the orders of his or her faith. If you present this quandary, be sure to provide an opportunity for a character to atone for violating his or her oath. Okay, I think knowing my players, or knowing the average player, they would probably break the oath without even realizing that they've done something wrong. A lot of the times. I'm not saying every time. The opportunity to atone for violating the oath. I mean, you don't have to provide that. They knew what they were doing when they broke it. I'm not on board with the last bit of advice. They can try, and if you can see them trying, then you might be tempted to provide one. But you don't have to. Rescue quandary. The adventurers must choose between catching or hurting the villain and saving innocent lives. For example, the adventurers might learn that the villain is camped nearby, but they also learn that another part of the villain's forces is about to march into a village and burn it to the ground. The characters must choose between taking out the villain or protecting innocent villagers, some of whom might be friends or family members. That's a classic. Happens a lot. Respect quandary. Two important allies give conflicting directions or advice to the adventurers. Perhaps the High Priest counsels the characters to negotiate peace with militaristic elves in the nearby forest, while a veteran warrior urges them to prove their strength with a decisive first strike. The adventurers can't follow both courses, and whichever ally they choose, the other loses respect for them and might no longer aid them. The examples they give here is not very interesting, but the idea of such a quandary is alright, it's pretty good. Where they had to choose to lose the favor of a significant NPC in the campaign. And another thing I like, that not all of them are life or death. Twists. A twist can complicate a story and make it harder for the characters to complete their goals. We can roll d10 for a twist. 1. The adventurers are racing against other creatures with the same or opposite goal. 2. The adventurers become responsible for the safety of a non-combatant NPC. 3. The adventurers are prohibited from killing the villain, but the villain has no compunctions about killing them. 4. The adventurers have a time limit. 5. The adventurers have received false or extraneous information. 6. Completing an adventure goal fulfills a prophecy or prevents the fulfillment of a prophecy. The adventurers have 2 different goals, but they can complete only one. 8. Completing the goal secretly helps the villain. 9. The adventurers must cooperate with a known enemy to achieve the goal. 10. The adventurers are under magical compulsion, such as Gia's spell, to complete their goal. I mean, most of them I wouldn't call twists exactly. The one where completing the goal secretly helps the villain, that sort of thing. It's a twist, but it's such an overdone twist that I'm not sure about this one. And most of the other ones, they're just gimmicks for a combat encounter, like the non-combatant NPC or the race part. I mean, I wouldn't call them twists exactly, but they're good ideas for something you could implement. Some I like more, some I like less. I like the video game-like ones kind of less, but I usually say that sort of thing whenever I read advice from this book. Side quests. You can also add one or more side quests to your adventure, taking the characters off the main story path defined by location or events. Side quests are peripheral to the character's primary goal, but successfully completing a side quest might provide a benefit toward completing the primary goal. We can roll a d8 on a side quest table. 1 is find a specific item rumored to be in the area. 2. Retrieve a stolen item in the villain's possession. 3. Receive information from an NPC in the area. 4. Rescue a captive. 5. Discover the fate of a missing NPC. 6. Slay a specific monster. 7. Discover the nature and origin of a strange phenomenon in the area. 8. Secure the aid of a character or creature in the area. Creating encounters. Okay, so that's probably the the part that I've been waiting for the most. It's not necessarily going to be the most interesting part, but that's, I think, the part I need the most. I need to learn about balancing combat encounters, because I want to start writing combat and character blocks, or whatever they're called, no, stat blocks, in my campaign. The sooner the better. And yeah, that's some crucial bit. So creating encounters. Encounters are the individual scenes in the larger story of your adventure. Okay, so they don't necessarily mean combat encounters here. That's important, I suppose. First and foremost, an encounter should be fun for the players. Second, it shouldn't be a burden for you to run. Beyond that, a well-crafted encounter usually has a straightforward objective, as well as some connection to the overarching story of your campaign, building on the encounters that precede it while foreshadowing encounters yet to come. An encounter has one of three possible outcomes. The characters succeed, the characters partly succeed, or the characters fail. The encounter needs to account for all three possibilities, and the outcome needs to have consequences so that the players feel like their successes and failures matter. Alright, I'm not on board with how structured this is. This is very rigid and structured, and it's also very goal-oriented. It's success or failure or partial success, but a lot of the people we meet in real life, we just meet them. It's random. It's not necessarily with a goal in mind. And if we read a work of fiction such as a book, there's a bunch of things that serve the flavor and introduce someone and don't necessarily have an objective behind them. They're not objective oriented or goal oriented or anything like that. I wouldn't think about creating encounters with a strict goal in mind, or being hell-bent on having them always progress the campaign. Just make it more organic. Try to aim for something more like a movie, something cinematic. That's my school of thought, quote unquote. But let's read on. Character objectives. When players don't know what they're supposed to do in a given encounter, anticipation and excitement can quickly turn to boredom and frustration. A transparent objective alleviates the risk of players losing interest. I mean, that could be a problem, but that doesn't reflect well on your players. If they're bored and think that they should be doing something, you should try to somehow, I don't know, suggest to them that they don't have to be there. They can take their characters somewhere else. They don't have to talk to the NPC. Running your game in a way where players feel like they need to run this pre-designed gauntlet, and if they're not doing anything that feels like it's been designed to be done, they're doing it wrong, like that sort of thing, that's not desirable. You should probably maybe talk with your players about that sort of thing. If encounters, quote unquote, cause players to lose interest and not know what to do or feel lost. But it's a real concern. I bet that happens. For example, if the overall story of your adventure involves the quest to deliver a priceless relic to a remote monastery, each encounter along the way is an opportunity to introduce a smaller objective that moves the quest forward. Encounters during the trip might see the adventurers accosted by enemies determined to steal the relic, or by monsters that are constantly threatening the monastery. Some players create their own objectives, which is to be expected and encouraged. It is, after all, as much the player's campaign as yours. For example, a character might try to bribe enemies rather than fight them, or chase after a fleeing enemy to see where it goes. Players who ignore objectives will have to deal with the consequences, which is another important facet of encounter design. Sample objectives. The following objectives can be used as foundations for encounters. Although these objectives focus on a single encounter during an adventure, using the same objective in multiple encounters allows you to combine those encounters into a larger obstacle or problem the adventurers must overcome. Make peace. The characters must convince two opposing groups or their leaders to end the conflict that embroils them. As a complication, the characters might have enemies on one or both of the opposing sides, or some other group or individual might be instigating the conflict to further its own ends. Protect an NPC or object. The characters must act as bodyguards or protect some object in their custody. As a complication, the NPC under the party's protection might be cursed, diseased, prone to panic attacks, too young or too old to fight, or apt to risk the lives of the adventurers through dubious decisions. The objects the adventurers have sworn to protect might be sentient, cursed, or difficult to transport. Retrieve an object. The adventurers must gain possession of a specific object in the area of the encounter, preferably before combat finishes. As a complication, enemies might desire the object as much as the adventurers do, forcing both parties to fight for it. Run a gauntlet. The adventurers must pass through a dangerous area. This objective is similar to retrieving an object insofar as reaching the exit is a higher priority than killing opponents in the area. A time limit adds a complication, as does a decision point that might lead characters astray. Other complications include traps, hazards, and monsters. Sneak in. The adventurers need to move through the encounter area without making the enemies aware of their presence. Complications might ensue if they are detected. It's pretty straightforward. Stop a ritual. The plots of evil cult leaders, malevolent warlocks, and powerful fiends often involve rituals that must be foiled. Characters engaged in stopping a ritual must typically fight their way through evil minions before attempting to disrupt the ritual's powerful magic. As a complication, the ritual might be close to completion when the characters arrive, imposing a time limit. Depending on the ritual, its completion might have immediate consequences as well. Take out a single target. The villain is surrounded by minions powerful enough to kill the adventurers. The characters can flee and hope to confront the villain another day, or they can try to fight their way through the minions to take out their target. As a complication, the minions might be innocent creatures under the villain's control. Killing the villains means breaking that control, but the adventurers must endure the minions' attacks until they do. A lot of those feel very video game-like, but I think I get the gist of it. In my preferred way of designing adventures, I'd like to think of those not so much as an encounters with a goal, but if you're trying to make the whole thing a cinematic experience, you could think of these as, key shots in a movie. Something that you know you want to happen, and it's going to be a hype, quote unquote, scene. It could be with a particular visual in mind, or a moral dilemma, or a twist, like a literal twist when someone changes sides, that sort of thing. Come up with a few of those and fill the rest with natural scenes, and it doesn't have to be objective oriented like they say. It doesn't have to be. I wouldn't make it objective oriented, but you may. Very well, whatever. Oh, and apparently the next paragraph is creating a combat encounter. When creating a combat encounter, let your imagination run wild and build something that your players will enjoy. Once you have the details figured out, use this section to adjust the difficulty of the encounter. Combat encounter difficulty. There are 4 categories of encounter difficulty. Easy. An easy encounter doesn't tax the character's resources or put them in serious peril. They might lose a few hit points, but victory is pretty much guaranteed. Medium. A medium encounter usually has 1 or 2 scary moments for the players, but the characters should emerge victorious with no casualties. 1 or more of them might need to use healing resources. Hard. A hard encounter could go badly for the adventurers. Weaker characters might get taken out of the fight, and there's a slim chance that 1 or more characters might die. Deadly. A deadly encounter could be lethal for 1 or more player characters. Survival often requires good tactics and quick thinking, and the party risks defeat. I think that a good idea, especially early on in the campaign, is to make a difficult encounter, but the penalty isn't one of them dying, because their enemies aren't aiming to kill them, for example, but losing something else that's important. Maybe they get beaten up, the enemies decide to deal non-lethal damage when they fight them, and they just rob them and take their stuff, right? That is a serious consequence of not winning in combat. But at the same time, it does not end your campaign. It could make your campaign much more interesting if they lose, and they make things not be predetermined. They make things in a way where characters can win and avoid something dreadful, and they can lose and still suffer the consequences. That's the sort of thing I like. I'm gonna pitch in and recommend trying that sort of thing. It can be really cool. Imagine the characters losing a lot of stuff to some bandits, and they're gonna remember this, and they're gonna probably want to get it back later on in the campaign. And even if they no longer need that first level junk they used to have, they might want to do it just for the revenge. Who knows, maybe they meet the villains 7 levels later and they're like super powerful by that point, and the villains are just as weak as they were when they faced the characters at level 1, and see what your players are gonna do. That sort of thing is exciting. Anyway, EXP thresholds by character level. Wait, what's this even supposed to be? They don't explain what it is, what an EXP threshold is. Or XP, it says XP, but I read it as EXP, my bad. Okay, maybe we'll get to it. I'll just read it without understanding it first. Maybe I'm not gonna read it because it's just numbers. It says, for example, for character level 1 or first level, Easy says 25, medium says 50, and hard says 75. And deadly says 100. That's threshold. Okay, yeah, it's gonna be here. It's gonna be right. Okay, challenge rating. Challenge rating. When putting together an encounter or adventure, especially at lower levels, exercise caution when using monsters whose challenge rating is higher than the party's average level. Such a creature might deal enough damage with a single action to take out adventurers of a lower level. For example, an ogre has a challenge rating of 2, but it can kill a first level wizard with a single blow. In addition, some monsters have features that might be difficult or impossible for lower level characters to overcome. For example, a Rakshasa has a challenge rating of 13 and is immune to spells of 6th level and lower. Spellcasters of 12th level or lower have no spells higher than 6th level, meaning that they won't be able to affect the Rakshasa with magic, putting the adventurers at a serious disadvantage. Such an encounter would be significantly tougher for the party than the monster's challenge rating might suggest. Okay, evaluating encounter difficulty. Use the following method to gauge the difficulty of any combat encounter. First, determine the XP thresholds for each character in the party. The XP thresholds by character level table below has 4 XP thresholds for each character level, 1 for each category of encounter difficulty. Use a character's level to determine his or her XP thresholds. Repeat this process for every character in the party. Okay, I think I need to think about it. So there's a table below. The XP thresholds by character level table has 4 XP thresholds for each character level. This is the table. Yeah, that's the table they mean. Okay, so it has 4 of these. 1 for each category of encounter difficulty, yeah, sure enough. Easy, medium, hard, deadly. Use a character's level to determine his or her XP thresholds. Okay, so it's usually gonna be all characters the same level. Repeat this process for every character in the party. Okay, so we're just gonna have to assign a number from, like for example, if characters are first level and the difficulty is hard, we just need to assign a 75 to each character and then proceed to step 2. Step 2, determine the party's XP threshold for each category of encounter difficulty. Add up the character's XP thresholds. This determines the party's XP threshold. You'll end up with 4 totals, 1 for each category of encounter difficulty. Okay, so it's the same thing. This is just for one character and this is for the whole party. Anyway. Okay, 1 for each category of encounter difficulty. For example, if your party includes 3 third level characters and 1 second level character, the party's total XP threshold would be as follows. Easy. There's 75, yeah, makes sense. Okay, but what's it for? What does it do? They should start with what it does, in my opinion. Record the totals because you can use them for every encounter in an adventure. Total the monster's XP. Add up the XP for all the monsters in the encounter. Every monster has an XP value in its start block. Modify total XP for multiple monsters. If the encounter includes more than 1 monster, apply a multiplier to the monster's total XP. The more monsters there are, the more attack rolls you're making against the characters in a given round, and the more dangerous the encounter becomes. To correctly gauge an encounter's difficulty, multiply the total XP of all the monsters in the encounter with value given in the encounter multipliers table. Okay. For example, if an encounter includes 4 monsters worth a total 500 XP, you would multiply the total XP of the monsters by 2 for an adjusted value of 1000 XP. The adjusted value is not what the monsters are worth in terms of XP. The adjusted value's only purpose is to help you accurately assess the encounter's difficulty. When making this calculation, don't count any monsters whose challenge rating is significantly below the average challenge rating of the monsters in the group, unless you think the weak monsters significantly contribute to the difficulty of the encounter. That's a horrible way of gauging the difficulty of it. I feel like it's gonna give ridiculous results. Results that don't always match reality. I'm gonna probably have to fiddle with it and test it by making stock characters and trying their abilities against my encounter to see if I can trust it. Anyway, 5. Compare XP. Compare the monster's adjusted XP value to the party's XP thresholds. The closest threshold that is lower than the adjusted XP value of the monsters determines the encounter's difficulty. For example, an encounter with 1 bugbear and 3 hobgoblins has an adjusted XP value of 1000, making it a hard encounter for a party of 3 third level characters and 1 second level character which has a hard encounter threshold of 825 XP and a deadly encounter threshold of 1400 XP. That doesn't sound easy at all, and it doesn't sound foolproof either, but we'll see. Party size. The preceding guidelines assume that you have a party consisting of 3 to 5 adventurers. I'm gonna aim for a party of 4, so yeah. If the party contains fewer than 3 characters, apply the next highest multiplier on the encounter table multipliers table. For example, apply a multiplier of 1.5 when the characters fight as single monsters, and multiplier of 5 for groups of 15 or more monsters. If the party contains 6 or more characters, use the next lowest multiplier on the table. Use a multiplier of 0.5%. I have a feeling that this isn't very amusing or educational so far. I'm retaining only like maybe 50% of this, but apparently they have mathematical guidelines for gauging if you're not overdoing it or if you're not underdoing it. If you guys in the chat have any advice or any input on whether you can trust these mathematical equations to actually tell you if the encounter is too hard, feel free to chime in, but no pressure. Multi-part encounters. Sometimes an encounter features multiple enemies that the party doesn't face all at once. For example, monsters might come at the party in waves. For such encounters, treat each discrete party or wave as a separate encounter for the purpose of determining its difficulty. I feel like they should probably include a section that give an example of picking out enemies to send against your party, and give an example of what's too much and what's too little. For example, take a party of 4 level 1s, because that's likely to be the case of many DMs, and tell you, Greg the DM chooses 4 goblins, and why 4 goblins is good, or why 4 goblins is too much, or why 4 goblins is too little. That sort of thing, and just walk you through it. Anyway, a party can't benefit from a short rest between parts of a multi-part encounter, so they won't be able to spend hit dice to regain hit points, or recover any abilities that require a short rest to regain. As a rule, if the adjusted XP value of the monsters in a multi-part encounter is higher than 1/3 of the party's expected XP total for the adventuring day, see the adventuring day below, the encounter is going to be tougher than the sum of its parts. This kind of touches on an interesting point. The point of rest. In most RPGs, all RPGs that I've played, people don't really rest between combat and another combat. It's a very, I don't know, Baldur's Gate thing to do, to rest between combats. And I know that a rest in Baldur's Gate is not a short rest, but a long one. But still, in a fantasy movie, imagine the main characters walking into a dungeon and they fight a bunch of goblins. They defeat them handily, and then they rest, and they fight more goblins, and they rest every time they do anything, just to be topped off. That's not very cinematic now, is it? If you could force your players, or not force, if your players are the kind of people that are willing to roleplay something interesting during the rest, maybe their characters talking, some banter, or some tactics discussion, whatever, during the rest, that could be interesting. I would absolutely agree to give them a short rest if they're just talking for a longer period of time. Building encounters on a budget. You can build an encounter if you know its desired difficulty. Party's XP thresholds give you an XP budget that you can spend on monsters to build easy. Okay, I hope there's going to be an easy way shown, because that stuff above, it doesn't seem very quick to do. The party's XP thresholds give you an XP budget that you can spend on monsters to build easy, medium, hard, and deadly encounters. Just remember that groups of monsters eat up more of that budget than the base XP values would indicate. See step 4. I no longer remember step 4. For example, using a party from step 2. Couldn't they have used the party that has uniform levels? For the love of God. For example, using the party from step 2, you can build a medium encounter by making sure that the adjusted EXP value of the monsters is at least 550 XP. The party's threshold for a medium encounter, and no more than 825, the party's threshold for a hard encounter. Single monster of challenge rating 3, such as a manticore or owlbear, is worth 700 XP. So that's one possibility. If you want a pair of monsters, each one will count for 1.5 times its base XP value. A pair of direwolves worth 200 XP each have an adjusted XP value of 600, making them a medium encounter for the party as well. Okay, easy enough. So when we get to monsters, I assume they're going to have an XP value, and then we're going to have to multiply it accordingly, right? And then we're going to have to match it against the XP threshold of our party. Easy peasy, I guess. Oh, not so easy peasy, but kind of complicated, but still easy enough. To assist with this approach, Appendix B presents a list of all monsters in the monster manual, organized by challenge rating. Oh, that's good. Convenient. The Adventuring Day. Assuming typical adventuring conditions and average luck, most adventuring parties can handle about 6 to 8 medium or hard encounters in a day. If the adventure has more easy encounters, the adventurers can get through more. If it has more deadly encounters, they can handle fewer. Okay. I don't think that putting them through 8 combat encounters in a single day is gonna be very interesting adventure-wise. It'd have to be. I don't know. I literally can't imagine a scenario where they would go through 8 combats in a single game. Well, maybe it could be across 2 games if they didn't rest. Yeah, I can see that. If it was strewn across a couple of games and your party is just the kind of party that doesn't rest because they go with a narrative that's reasonable. In the same way, you figure out the difficulty of an encounter, you can use the XP values of monsters and other opponents in an adventure as a guideline for how far the party is likely to progress. For each encounter in the party, use the Adventuring Day XP table to estimate how much XP the character is expected to earn in a day. Add together the values of all party members to get a total for all parties Adventuring Day. This provides a rough estimate of the adjusted XP values for encounters the party can handle before the characters will need to take a long rest. Okay, Adventuring Day XP, adjusted XP per day per character. Level first, it's 300, level second, it's 600. Okay, let's not read that, it's just numbers and it doesn't tell us anything yet. If we ever need to use it, we're probably going to have to come back to it anyway. Short rests in general. Over the course of a full adventuring day, the party will likely need to take 2 short rests about 1/3 and 2/3 of the way through the day. The party's not gonna know if they're supposed to take 2 rests. I'm gonna be very cautious with that sort of thing, and I'm not gonna encourage my players to rest every now and then for mechanical reasons. In fact, I'm gonna try to discourage them from resting for mechanical reasons. An encounter can be made easier or harder based on the choice of location and the situation. Increase the difficulty of the encounter by 1 step from easy to medium, for example, if the characters have a drawback that the enemies don't. Reduce the difficulty by 1 step if the characters have a benefit that the enemies don't. Any additional benefit or drawback pushes the encounter 1 step in the appropriate direction. If the characters have both a benefit and a drawback, the 2 cancel each other out. Situational drawbacks include the following. The whole party is surprised, the enemy isn't. The enemy has cover and the party doesn't. The characters are unable to see the enemy. The characters are taking damage every round from some environmental effect or magical source, and the enemy isn't. The characters are hanging from a rope in the midst of scaling a sheer wall or cliff, stuck to the floor, or otherwise in a situation that greatly hinders their mobility or makes them sitting ducks. The Cliffs of Insanity. Situational benefits are similar to drawbacks except that they benefit the characters instead of the enemy. Fun combat encounters. Oh, do tell me what a fun combat encounter looks like. The following features can add more fun and suspense to a combat encounter. Terrain features that pose inherent risks to both the characters and the enemies, such as a frayed rope bridge and pools of green slime. Terrain features that provide a change of elevation, such as pits, stacks of empty crates, ledges and balconies. Features that either inspire or force characters and their enemies to move around, such as chandeliers, kegs of gunpowder or oil, and whirling blade traps. Fun combat encounters 64 owlbears. You could probably make an encounter like that, really make an encounter like that, because realistically, the whole 64 owlbears can't hit at once. Movement is going to prevent them, right? You could make it a Sparta kind of deal, where you're fighting 8 at most at the same time. And a really high level party could take 64 owlbears. I'm gonna note that down. 64 owlbears is a fun encounter. Anyway, fun combat encounters, terrain features, okay, chandeliers, that sort of thing. They mentioned exploding barrels. Exploding barrels was such a classic, but not in TTRPG. At least not for me. I have never used an exploding barrel in a tabletop RPG. Which is, maybe it's a mistake, honestly. It's such a video game trope, but that could do well. Once, it wouldn't hurt to do a video game thingy, like, once, maybe? Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I'd be tempted to do something, like an exploding barrel. Features that either inspire or force characters and their enemies to move around, such as, okay, chandeliers, kegs of gunpowder or oil, and whirling blade traps. Enemies in hard-to-reach locations or defensive positions, so that characters who normally attack at range are forced to move around the battlefield. Different types of monsters working together. Random encounters. As characters explore a wilderness area or dungeon complex, they are bound to encounter the unexpected. Random encounters are a way to deliver the unexpected. They are usually presented in the form of a table. When a random encounter occurs, you roll a die and consult the table to determine what the party encounters. Some players and DMs view random encounters in an adventure as time wasters, yet well-designed random encounters can serve a variety of useful purposes. I guess I'm kind of with the people who say it's a bit of a time waster. Generally because I don't much like combat for the sake of combat. Maybe if you wanted to create, right, it says so right in the next bullet point, create a sense of urgency, right? That could be a good reason to do it. But I guess I'm not a fan of random combat encounters. Create urgency. Adventurers don't tend to dawdle if the threat of a random encounter is hanging over their heads. Wanting to avoid wandering monsters creates a strong incentive to look for a safe place to rest. Rolling dice behind the DM screen can often accomplish this even without an actual encounter. No way, that would never work against my players. Establish atmosphere. The appearance of thematically linked creatures as random encounters helps to create a consistent tone and atmosphere for an adventure. For example, an encounter table filled with bats, wraiths, giant spiders, and zombies creates a sense of horror and tells the adventurers to prepare for battle with even more powerful creatures of the night. I mentioned that would never work for my players, but actually this time around I'm not gonna play with the people I used to play like way back when, for better or for worse, and I'm gonna be with a brand new batch of players, people I don't know necessarily, so it might work. Well, since we're gonna be playing online, maybe it's not gonna work because they're not gonna see my screen or hear the dice rattling. I guess I have to prepare for the unexpected when it comes to people. The people factor is probably always the most dangerous. Drain character resources. Random encounters can drain the party's hit points and spell slots, leaving the adventurers feeling underpowered and vulnerable. This creates tension, as players are forced to make decisions based on the fact that their characters aren't at full strength. That's a good one. You want to drain characters' resources, and you really don't want your characters, or rather your players, you don't want your players to feel like they're gonna be topped off for every encounter. They're gonna have full HP, they're gonna have their full combat capabilities like they would in Baldur's Gate, because that's not very cinematic, is it? But how to do it? That's a more difficult question, because while random encounters can do that for you, I feel like random encounters slow down the plot far too much for such little benefit. The next reason you might want random encounters is provide assistance. Random encounters can benefit the characters instead of hindering or harming them. Helpful creatures or NPCs might provide the adventurers with useful information or assistance when they most need it. Add interest. Random encounters can reveal details about your world. They can foreshadow danger or provide hints that will help the adventurers prepare for encounters to come. Reinforce campaign themes. Random encounters can remind the players of the major themes of the campaign. For example, if your campaign features an ongoing war between two nations, you might design random encounter tables to reinforce the ever-present nature of the conflict. In friendly territory, your tables might include bedraggled troops returning from battle, refugees fleeing invading forces, heavily guarded caravans full of weapons, and lone messengers on horseback riding for the front lines. While characters are in hostile territory, the tables might include battlefields littered with the recently slain, armies of evil humanoids on the march, improvised gibbets holding the bodies of deserters who tried to flee the conflict. Bedraggled, good word. Random encounters should never be tiresome to you or your players. You don't want the players to feel as if they aren't making progress because another random encounter brings their progress to a halt whenever they try to move forward. Likewise, you don't want to spend time distracted by random encounters that add nothing to the adventure narrative or that interfere with the overall pace you're trying to set. And that's the big thing. It really slows down the plot if you do random encounters. And I do it for the plot. I play for the plot a lot of the time, for the interactions, for the social interactions between players, and the DM and the NPCs. That's the biggest thing for me, and that's why I don't like random encounters personally, and why I'm probably not gonna do them unless I can think of something creative that I like with them. Probably no. Not every DM likes to use random encounters. You might find that they distract from your game or are otherwise causing more trouble than you want. If random encounters don't work for you, don't use them. That's me, I guess that's me right there. Triggering random encounters. Because you want random encounters to build on the intended narrative of a game session, not compete with it, you should choose the placement of these encounters carefully. Think about a random encounter under any of the following circumstances. The players are getting off track and slowing down the game. The characters stop for a short or long rest. Characters are undertaking a long, uneventful journey. Characters draw attention to themselves and they should be keeping a low profile. That's cheating a bit. That's like punishing players for going slower than you'd like. That's a bit unfair. It's like that trope of a dungeon master sending a meteor at the players because they did something he didn't like. Checking for random encounters. You decide when a random encounter happens or you roll. Instead of checking for a random encounter once every hour, or once every 4 to 8 hours, or once during the day, or once during a long rest, whatever makes the most sense based on how active the area is. If you roll, do so with a d20. If the result is 18 or higher, a random encounter occurs. You then roll on an appropriate random number table to determine what the adventurers meet, re-rolling if the die result doesn't make sense given the circumstances. Okay, so one circumstance under which I will do random encounters every time is when players camp for the night. If they're camping in an area that isn't completely safe, you need to somehow communicate to them that this place is not safe and they have to act accordingly. Their characters have to act accordingly. They have to set up a watch, maybe do a campfire, that sort of thing, because I like players going through these sort of actions so long as it's done quickly, and it can be done quickly once you've agreed on some things. So yeah, I would do random encounters for a night's rest, a chance of a random encounter. I wouldn't do it like a guaranteed one, obviously. If you roll, do so with a d20. If the result is 18 or higher, a random encounter occurs. You then roll on an appropriate random encounter table to determine what the adventurers meet, re-rolling if the die results don't make sense given the circumstances. Random encounter tables might be provided as part of the adventure you're running, or you can use the information in this chapter to build your own. Creating your own tables is the best way to reinforce the themes and flavor of your home campaign. Not every run-in with another creature counts as a random encounter. Encounter tables don't usually include rabbits hopping through the undergrowth, harmless rats scurrying through dungeon halls, or average citizens walking through the streets of a city. Random encounter tables present obstacles and events that advance the plot, foreshadow important elements or themes of the adventure, and provide fun distractions. Creating random encounter tables. Creating your own random encounter tables is straightforward. Determine what sort of encounters might occur in a given dungeon area. Figure out the likelihood of a particular encounter occurring, then arrange the results. An encounter in this case could be a single monster or NPC, a group of monsters or NPCs, a random event such as an earth tremor or a parade, or a random discovery such as a charred corpse or a message scrawled on a wall. Assemble your encounters. Once you've established the location through which the adventurers are likely to pass, be it wilderness area or dungeon complex, make a list of creatures that might be found wandering there. If you're not sure which creatures to include, Appendix B has a list of monsters organized by terrain types. That's great, actually. I'm gonna look for a desert terrain type because I need some weak monsters for a desert, ideally weak. For a sylvan woodland, you might create a table that includes centaurs, fairy dragons, pixies, sprites, dryads, satyrs, blink dogs, elves, owlbears, trants, giant owls, and a unicorn. If elves inhabit the forest, the table might also include elf druids and elf scouts. Perhaps gnolls are threatening the woods, so adding gnolls and hyenas to the table would be a fun surprise for players. Another fun surprise would be a wandering predator, such as a displacer beast that likes to hunt blink dogs. The table could also use a few random encounters of a less monstrous nature, such as a grove of burnt trees, the handiwork of gnolls, an ivy-covered elven statue, and a plant with glowing berries that turn creatures invisible when ingested. Okay, that sort of thing is kind of interesting, but at the same time also kind of convenient, kind of forced, right? If it wasn't a plot point, it wouldn't happen in a movie, but it could totally happen in a video game, just as a mechanical gimmick. So it kind of takes the style of the of the adventure towards the more video game like style that I do not like, that I despise. In fact, I despise the video game like style for TTRPG, because why play TTRPG if you don't want to play it like a TTRPG and you want to play it like a video game? Play a video game then. Anyway, when choosing monsters for a random encounter table, try to imagine why the monsters would be encountered outside their lairs. What is each monster up to? Is it on a patrol, hunting for food, searching for something? Also consider whether a creature is moving stealthily as it travels through the area. As with planned encounters, random encounters are more interesting when they happen in memorable locations. Outdoors, the adventurers might be crossing a forest clearing when they encounter a unicorn, or be pushing through a dense section of forest when they come across a nest of spiders. Crossing a desert, characters might discover an oasis hunted by whites, or a rocky outcropping on which a blue dragon perches. Okay, so we have whites in the desert and blue dragons apparently. I can't have a blue dragon for the adventure I want. And I wasn't even considering undead at all, but I might consider undead. Actually, maybe ghouls. Ghouls could be good. I don't know how strong a ghoul is, but it would fit thematically. Because, I'm not gonna say. I'm gonna be putting my adventure on the internet for people to play, and yeah, if someone wants to run my adventure after hearing that, yeah, they can play it spoiler free. Yes. Crossing a desert, characters might discover an oasis hunted by whites or a rocky outcropping on which a blue dragon perches. Probabilities. A random encounter table can be created in a number of ways, ranging from simple, roll 1d6 to 1 of 6 possible encounters, or complicated, roll percentile dice, modify for time of day, and cross-index the modified number with the dungeon level. That's a horrible way. The sample encounter table presented here uses a range of 2 to 20, 19 entries total, generated using a 1d12 plus 1d8. The probability curve ensures that encounters appearing in the middle of the table are more likely to occur than encounters placed at the beginning or end of the table. A roll of 2 or 20 is rare, about a 1% chance of either, while each of the rolls from 9 to 13 occurs a little over 8% of the time. The Sylvan Forest Encounters table is an example of a random encounter table that implements the ideas mentioned above. Creature names in bold refer to stat blocks that appear in the monster manual. Oh, an owlbear. He looks kinda cool and kinda cute. I like his face, his owl face. Random encounter challenge. Random encounters need not be level appropriate challenges for the adventurers, but it's considered bad form to slaughter a party using a random encounter, since most players consider this ending to be an unsatisfying one. Yeah, most do. Not all random encounters with monsters need to be resolved through combat. A first level party of adventurers have a random encounter of a young dragon circling above a forest canopy in search of a quick meal, but the characters should have the option to hide or bargain for their lives if the dragon spots them. Similarly, the party might encounter a stone giant roaming the hills, but it might have no intention of harming anyone. In fact, it might shy away from the party because of its reclusive nature. The giant might attack only characters who annoy it. That said, a random encounter table usually includes hostile, though not necessarily evil monsters that are meant to be fought. The following monsters are considered appropriate combat challenges. A single monster with a challenge rating equal to or lower than the party's level. A group of monsters whose adjusted XP value constitutes an easy, medium or hard challenge for the party, as determined using the encounter building guidelines earlier in this chapter. Okay, so on the topic of putting a young, what color was it? Blue dragon? Young dragon, they don't specify color. So anyway, the encounters such as a dragon circling above or a reclusive giant, I'm not so sure about putting those in because your players are not gonna know. A lot of the time your players are not gonna know that the first level party cannot take down a dragon. Especially since the game is called Dungeons and Dragons, they're gonna expect, okay, so we're supposed to be fighting dragons, let's take it on. Or that they're not supposed to pester a giant because it could crush them. If you can arrange it in such a way that the novice player can't bungle it too badly, then okay, sure. And another thing is that in character, one of the people in the adventuring party might consider themselves heroic, strong, powerful, and obligated to fight the monsters of the wilds, and he's gonna try to attack it, right? Because that's in character for them. You don't want to put people in a squeeze where they have to metagame it by not attacking it for mechanics reason, or be faithful to his character and wipe the party there and then. That's I guess a no-no. What if you were just to see a monster, right? That's fine, that's fair. Interesting. It offers some interest. It could offer some foreshadowing. If you met the dragon like 11, 15 games down the line, that would be cool. I don't think that even a newbie level 1 party is dumb enough to try and kill the dragon. No, come on. If you're playing Dungeons and Dragons for the first time, you're not gonna know that you can't take a dragon. And when it comes to dumb people in TTRPG, it's just as any other hobby. We're not free from dumb people. Anyway, okay, Sylvan Forest encounters. 1d12 plus d8 encounter. 2. 1 Displacer Beast. 3. 1 Gnoll Pack Lord and 2d4 Gnolls. 4. 1d4 Gnolls and 2d4 Hyenas. 5. A grove of burnt trees. Characters searching the area, succeeding on a DC 10 Wisdom survival check. Find Gnoll tracks. Following the tracks 1d4 hours leads to an encounter with Gnolls, to the discovery of dead Gnolls with elven arrows sticking out of their flea-ridden corpses. Okay, so that one is pretty imaginative. I like that one. But the other three, they kind of don't bring too much to the adventure. 6. 1 Giant Owl. 7. An ivy-covered statue of an elven deity or hero. 8. 1 Dryad 50% or 1d4 Satyrs 50%. 9. 1d4 Centaurs. 10. 2d4 Scouts Elves. 1 Scout carries a horn and can use its action to blow it. If the horn is blown within the forest, roll on the table again. If the result indicates a monster encounter, the indicated monster or monsters arrive in 1d4 minutes. New arrivals other than Gnolls, Hyenas, Owlbears, and Displacer Beasts are friendly towards the Scouts. 11. 2d4 Pixies 50% or 2d4 Sprites 50%. 12. 1 Owlbear. 13. 1d4 Elks 75% or 1 Giant Elk 25%. 14. 1d4 Blink Dogs. 15. A magical plant with 2d4 glowing berries. A creature that ingests a berry becomes invisible for 1 hour or until it attacks or casts a spell. Once picked, a berry loses its magical effect after 12 hours. Berries will grow at midnight, but if all its berries are picked, the plant becomes non-magical and grows no more berries. Sag. 16. An elven tune carried on a gentle breeze. 17. 1d4 orange 75% or blue 25% fairy dragons. 18. 1 druid elf. The druid is initially indifferent towards the party but becomes friendly if the characters agree to rid the forest of its gnoll infestation. 19. 1 Trant. The Trant is friendly if the party includes 1 or more elves or is accompanied by a visible fey creature. The Trant is hostile if the characters are carrying open flames. Otherwise, it is indifferent and doesn't announce its presence as the characters pass by. 20. 1 Unicorn. Actually, on the topic of players not being acquainted with what monsters do and how strong they are, how would you communicate to the players what their characters might know, but the players might not know? Like in a flavorful way. I've been thinking about a different example of this. If you have a wizard character, right? And the player that's playing as a wizard character has no idea about D&D world, what the planes are, what's arcane magic and what's sorcerer magic and that sort of thing. And it would be helpful if the player knew it, so they could talk in character about this to his party of warriors and rogues and that sort of thing when they want something from him, something magical from him. For example, they want to travel to a different plane. He wants to tell them that it's impossible. How do you prepare your player to tell them? Obviously, I wouldn't try to teach the player all that there is to know, because it would bore the player to death. Like for a newer player, they wouldn't remember it and they would find it boring and unfun, and it could be a huge turn off for the game. So I've been thinking, maybe you could do a way where the character undergoes apprenticeship in an interesting way during the game, but you'd have to design it. Maybe tell your players what D&D even is before the game. Well, obviously you're gonna have to tell them what D&D is before the game, but there's so much to it. I mean, there's so much to D&D, there's so much to know. For example, as a wizard, you'd want to tell them about the planes. If they're a cleric, there's so much to tell about deities, and your players are gonna forget it. Half of it is gonna sound like gibberish to them when they're new to role-playing games, right? But I've been thinking, maybe you could design an adventure that shows an in-character progress. They're starting as an apprentice that can cast Identify and Magic Missile, but they're not really a wizard, right? And during the course of the adventure, they are being told about the construction of the planes, for example, by a master wizard, and then they have to use this knowledge during an elaborate puzzle, for example. That could work, but you'd have to design it well, so that the other players are involved, and I mean, it's too much for a session 0, in my opinion. It's way too much for a session 0. You can't unload all of this on a session 0. Like, I wouldn't. But I guess to each their own. If you're playing with more geeky people who are more receptive to that sort of thing, I guess maybe that's fine. Even during podcasts in D&D, there's people who know very little about the D&D worlds, but they just want to enjoy a cool fantasy romp. Casual players are gonna be much more ignorant, I guess, and that's fine. I guess that's cool. It's good that people from all walks of life are considering geeky hobbies not to be that geeky anymore. We're in chapter 4 already. We were in chapter 4 already, and what's more, we got to read some more that day, but since our YouTube formula is to end the video on a chapter's end, this is as far as this one goes. If you enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like or even check me out on Twitch, the link is in the description. Thank you for watching, may you succeed on all the wisdom saving throws of your life. Bye.